Good evening, everybody. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Pearl of the Islands Foundation and the advisory board of which I'm a member. So a warm welcome to our guest, Dr. John Pahl, although the name is spelt like Pahl, but it's pronounced Paul, so I've learnt that tonight, and Professor Douglas Pratt and Dr. Chris Galloway. And welcome to everybody who's come tonight. So first of all, I'll just mention a little bit about what is Pearl of the Islands Foundation. So it's a non-profit organisation established by mainly New Zealanders of Turkish descent in 2006. And it works comprehensively to celebrate diversity, and I think the fact that they invited me to join their advisory board, a Jewish woman joining a Muslim organisation advisory board, just says it all. And they really specialise in dialogue. So tonight is a form of dialogue, reaching out to people, and this is constantly what PIF is actually doing. And they're from the Hizmet movement, and the relevance of that will very quickly become apparent. So I've been involved with PIF for the last 10 years, and really I think they've made a big difference to my life. I'm very proud to be associated with Pearl of the Islands. So now I'd like to warmly welcome our speaker, Dr. John Pahl. So Dr. Pahl is an historian of religions and professor at United Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia, Gettysburg, and he received his PhD from the University of Chicago Divinity School. So he's just recently published this book, which is about Fethullah Gulen, who is the leader of the Hizmet movement, Why a Muslim Scholar in Pennsylvania Matters to the World. And he's also authored another 7 books and is also a pastor at the Union Congregational United Church of Christ in Green Bay, Wisconsin. So Dr. Pahl is a very personable man. We've just had dinner with him and met his wife Lisa, who's here, and they're very much family people and love animals, we've discovered, so they're good people. Not biased or anything. And he also enjoys gardening, relaxing with his extended family and playing jazz as an avid amateur saxophonist, and I believe there's going to be a bit of that happening somewhere else after this function.
True.
So I also welcome Professor Douglas Pratt, who taught religious studies at the University of Waikato for over 30 years until the mid-2018, and he currently holds appointments as Honorary Professor in Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Auckland, and he has a number of other appointments and associations with overseas universities. Professor Pratt's research interests include Christian-Muslim relations, interfaith dialogue, and contemporary issues in religion. Then our facilitator, welcome to Dr. Chris Galloway, who teaches public relations at the Auckland campus of Massey University. He has a special interest in the Middle East and nearby countries and has visited and lectured in the region multiple times. He has published on Islamic State and its media strategy, that sounds really interesting, and on media war between Israel and the Palestinians, along with articles examining the potential impacts of new technologies on public relations practice. And I once worked with Chris, but sadly he doesn't remember. So I'll now invite Chris to introduce the topic that Dr. Pahl will be speaking on.
I'm pleased, of course, that we have some parliamentary representation here tonight. The House is not exactly a place for dialogue, one could suggest. The subtitle of this book is one that intrigues me. Why a Muslim Scholar in Pennsylvania Matters to the World. And the title under which this event was promoted was talking about altruism without borders I guess when we think about altruism, people doing things without any expectation of reward, we tend to think, why would they do it? What is it that motivates them? And what we find in looking at a book like this and a subject like this in the more than capable hands of our speaker tonight is that there is no service, no altruism worthy of the name without a spiritual foundation, without a spiritual engagement. And this is what we can hope to hear unpacked for us by our distinguished guest tonight. So please join me in welcoming Professor John.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you to all of you for coming. I look forward to your response to what I have to say tonight as well. But I must warn you, attending an interfaith event like this can be dangerous. It can change your life for the better in many, many ways. It's okay? Can bring you new friends, awaken you to new possibilities, and set a horizon for your work and life that gives it more profound meaning than you ever thought possible. I know this is true because it was an event very much like this one, where I was first introduced to the name Fethullah Gulen in Philadelphia in 2006. That's where I first began the research that led to the recently released biography of this gentle, intelligent, and compassionate man who is a Sufi mystic like Rumi, but also a practical public theologian and preacher of nonviolence like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So before I dig into why I undertook that research and disclose just a little bit of what I discovered about Mr. Gulen and how he can help us all to be altruists without borders, I think it would be in keeping with our theme for tonight to try to find a way to laugh together. So much of our world is torn at present by what I can only call evil, by irrationality, by lying, by scapegoating vulnerable people. One of my favorite Christian saints, Dame Julian of Norwich, who lived through the plague in the 14th century, once said that the way to fight evil isn't to cudgel the brain, or as I translate this for undergraduates, the way to fight evil isn't to bang your head against the wall. The way to fight evil, she said, is to live a life of love and laughter. That positive approach is in keeping with the spirituality I discovered at the heart of Fethullah Gulen's life and at the heart of the global Hizmet, service, altruistic movement he has inspired. That movement is built around a public theology of Mushpat Harakat, nonviolent, positive action that seeks common ground and ways to work together, no matter the obstacles, to build mutual trust. Now, as you heard, I'm a pastor at Union Congregational United Church of Christ in Green Bay, Wisconsin, as well as a scholar. Frequently on Sunday mornings, I do a children's sermon. Often I try a little humor to help forge mutual trust. Now, I'm not by nature a funny person. I'm German and Norwegian. Cultures known much more for our stoic iciness than our warm laughter. So I need your help, in other words, to get through these truly terrible knock-knock jokes. You know how they work? Okay, so help me out. Knock-knock. Ach. Bless you, my friends. Couple more. Knock, knock. Tank. You're welcome. One more. Knock, knock. Olive. I love you too. Yeah, oh. Actually, that's what's known as a transition. Because love, seviyor in Turkish, is at the heart of Fethullah Gülen's life and teachings, and at the heart of the altruism or other directedness of the people of Hizmet. Mr. Gülen was born in 1938 in a tiny little village, Koracuk, in northeastern Turkey. His father, Ramiz, was a scholar and preacher, and his mother, Rafia, was Fethullah's first Quran teacher. When I interviewed Fethullah's older sister, Nuriyat, in her modest apartment, she simply said, "We were a happy family." Trust that leads to altruism is learned in families, however configured, and strengthening communities means supporting those families. But once he left home, Fethullah Gülen was not destined for a simple or an easy life. It's a contradiction that runs like a red thread throughout the history of religions. Those who are most loving, most altruistic, and most peaceful become targets for the harshest persecution and slander. Mr. Gülen reads hundreds of pages a day, and his thought has been informed by many sources, by the Quran and Hadith, of course, and by the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, by Western thinkers like Kant and Dostoevsky, among many others, and also by an early 20th century Kurdish reformer and scholar by the name of Said Nursi. According to Nursi, modern societies were beset by three central problems: ignorance, poverty, and disunity or violence. Fethullah Gülen has made this triple threat to humanity of ignorance, poverty, and disunity or violence the central nexus of problems he sought to resolve in his life. And he proposed doing so as follows. Ignorance is overcome by education. And so people of Hizmet have built schools all over the globe, mostly math and science academies, overcoming the warfare between science and religion, right? And engaging a kind of altruism toward nature that we desperately need in this day and age of climate crisis. Secondly, the problem of poverty is solved by wealth generation. That is, social enterprises that generate income, that give people jobs, that support the dignity of work so that people can contribute to building stronger civil societies. So social enterprises, wealth generation that then solves problems such as the problem of ignorance or the problem of disunity and violence. And so the problem of disunity and violence then would be solved by building bridges, by dialogue, right? By bringing people together like this in what seems to be a simple gathering, but in fact can have profound significance, as I experienced in my life, by making friends, by drinking tea, and then repeating. Make friends, drink tea, repeat. So, for inspiring this platform of learning, social enterprise, and dialogue, Mr. Gülen has been imprisoned repeatedly, forced to go on the run in his own country for 6 years, and now been slandered by the Turkish government as a terrorist, which is a lot like calling Jesus a terrorist. And those associated with him have similarly been vilified and targeted, leading to a brain drain and exodus of truly quality and qualified people from Turkey to the benefit of places like New Zealand. As you probably know, the Turkish government has in recent years sought relentlessly, to the tune of millions of dollars in expenditures, to extradite Mr. Gülen from his modest retreat center in the Poconos of Pennsylvania, where he has lived since 1999. They have also shut down newspapers and other media outlets and illegally seized assets from people just associated with Mr. Gülen, to the tune of anywhere between 11 and 30 billion And the current dictatorial regime in Turkey has harassed, imprisoned, and probably tortured people of Hizmet, people of service. And yet, here we are, in Auckland, New Jersey. And in Auckland, New Zealand. Well, that's what you call a Freudian slip, if there ever was one. Sorry, the American jet lag just kind of landed on me right there. That's a 747. New Jersey is nothing like this, I guarantee you. Although there is a lot of good Hizmet happening in New Jersey as well. So we're here in Auckland, New Zealand, engaged in positive action on behalf of overcoming ignorance, breaking bread, drinking tea, building mutual trust. Perhaps the central feature of the nonviolence taught and practiced by individuals like Gandhi, Dr. King, the Buddhist peace builder Thich Nhat Hanh, and the Liberian Nobel Peace Prize laureate Lima Boy is central principle of nonviolence. Do not mirror evil. That is, do not react to attacks in kind, but stay true to your deepest principles and beliefs. Do not mirror evil could easily be a motto for Mr. Gulen's life and teachings. He's lived a life of voluntary poverty, never married, and spends most of his time in prayer. He's not a politician, has never endorsed a candidate or party, and although his life has been politicized, to understand him politically is to misunderstand him. He's a scholar and teacher first, a preacher second, and his teaching and preaching has simply inspired men and women to practice authentic, altruistic Islam. Or at least that's how he would put it. There's nothing special or unique about him, he'd say, other than the deep peace that comes from being an authentic Muslim. Like Rumi, Gulen believes that we can build mutual trust by loving God, which means, practically, loving one another. The first lines of his most accessible book, lines that I heard at that event in 2006 in Philadelphia, the first lines read as follows: love is the most essential element of every being. Love is the most radiant light, and it is the greatest power, able to resist and overcome all else. End quote. It was this teaching about the power of love that resonated with my own Christian ethic and that drew me ever more deeply into Mr. Gulen's teaching and influence. I studied Turkish, poorly, the Güzel ama zor Turkish language, the beautiful but difficult Turkish language. I conducted dozens of interviews of people close to Mr. Gulen and with his opponents, and then traveled in the footsteps of the one they call Hoca Efendi, honored teacher, wherever he had lived and preached, from Korajuk to Edirne to Izmir to Istanbul to the Poconos. And what I gleaned from my studies is a new appreciation of what I call deep peace. That is, there is a peace that is beyond politics and beyond social life that drives to the very heart of what a human being is all about. And fostering that peace is a goal across our religious traditions at their depth. Between us, Christians and Muslims and Jews alone make up well more than half of the world's population. And although the US and Europe and Australia and New Zealand are to a degree outliers to this trend, globally the percentage of people who claim religious faith is growing. So, what would the world be like if we, not if, when we, people of faith, joined together with other people of goodwill to actually practice this central teaching that flows from the deep peace that has enabled our traditions to last for millennia, not just for centuries, for millennia. That central principle to love one another. Almost for certainly, living out that simple teaching would lead to the ending of us-them divisions between traditions. Almost surely, living out that altruistic teaching, love one another, would end divisions between people who claim a faith tradition and people who don't. Almost surely, if we, people of faith, lead the way in practicing what we preach, to love one another, we could produce an unprecedented era of cooperation to address problems like climate change, poverty, women's rights, gender equality, and racism. All of which Mr. Gulen speaks about in ways that seek to inspire us to engage in positive action to foster mutual trust. And this is not some rosy idealism. I've written about religious violence, about an empire of sacrifice, the religious origins of American violence, the title of my last book. And I have no illusions about the harsh side of religions. And yet, building on the insights of people like Steven Pinker, the Harvard neuropsychiatrist, Hans Rosling, the epidemiologist, and Bill and Melinda Gates, we can recognize together and hold together in our brains two apparently contradictory ideas. One being, things are bad. There's lots of work for us to do. And yet at the same time, we can also recognize that things are getting better in dramatic and sometimes amazing ways. We live in the most peaceful era of human history ever. Lowest international warfare, lowest infant mortality rates, greatest life expectancies, lowest degrees of extreme poverty. These are all facts about our time that when we have eyes to see, we can recognize are growing, while also recognize that things are bad. There's plenty of work for us to do. And our religious traditions can, ought, must lead the way. I've gained the capacity to see such a vision of how religion is contributing to the world getting better, while also being able to see that things are still plenty bad, from my research into the life and teachings of Fethullah Gulen and into my relations with these altruists without borders who are here in our room. So with your indulgence, and by this point you really don't have much say in the matter, I'll close my talk with the final pages of my biography of Mr. Gulen, which reflects on Mr. Gulen's inevitable death and on the troubles people of his met have experienced in recent years. So with your pardon. Finding hope in the midst of trouble has been a regular, almost routine part of his biography. And by now there were islands of peace, as he called them, on every continent. Those peace islands were the schools, dialogue centers, and social enterprises wherever they operated. And those peace islands were countries where new friends could be made and where Muslims could practice their faith without oppression. For if an old man might be tempted during a cold winter in exile to despair of ever again seeing green spring days, as he wrote in a poem written while in America, in fact, as Gulen also wrote, eyes on a very long horizon and tied to no specific nation, and now I'm quoting Mr. Gulen, our old world will experience an amazing springtime before its demise. This springtime will see the gap between rich and poor narrow. The world's riches will be distributed more justly according to work, capital, and needs. There will be no discrimination based on race, color, language, or worldview. And basic human rights and freedoms will be protected. Individuals will come to the fore, and learning how to realize their potential will ascend on the way to becoming the most elevated human on the wings of love, knowledge, and belief. In this new springtime, when scientific and technological progress has been taken into consideration, people will understand that the current level of science and technology resembles the stage of life when an infant is learning how to crawl. Humanity will organize trips into space as if they were merely traveling to another country. It's a long trip from Chicago to this side of the world. Still, travelers on the way to God, Mr. Guillen goes on, those devotees of love who have no time for hostility, will carry the inspirations within their spirits to other worlds. Yes, this springtime will rise on the foundations of love, compassion, mercy, dialogue, acceptance of others, mutual respect, justice, and rights. It will be a time in which humanity will discover its real essence. Goodness and kindness, righteousness and virtue will come to the fore and form the basic essence of the world. No matter what happens, the world will come to this path sooner or later. Nobody can prevent this. We pray and beg that the infinitely compassionate one will not let our hopes and expectations come to nothing. End quote. In a winter of brutal strongmen, such hopes for a glorious spring seemed utopian. No better than a prayer. And yet, if there is one thing that Fethullah Gulen really knows how to do, it is to pray. So when he encouraged people that this is a quote, difficulties increase in accordance with the greatness of the consequent reward, that too was a prayer. But it was also a maxim that had been tested in Fethullah Gulen's life and proven true almost from its beginning. To some, the oppression in Turkey signaled the death of Gulen's dream for a golden generation. And there was surely a death looming. The boy from Korajuk was now a frail, old man. And yet Fethullah Gulen's life was never about a short-term horizon to be measured only by the brief span of 80 years and 10. He believed in heaven. He believes in resurrection. He believes in justice. These beliefs were not tied only to the next news cycle, the next election cycle, or even to an individual life cycle. His horizon was eternal. And if the moral arc of the universe was long, and it seemed particularly long in the second decade of the 21st century, Gulen and people close to him also shared the belief of many people of faith that the moral arc of the universe did bend toward justice. They were also convinced that it was humanity's duty to help bend the moral arc of the universe in that direction. As Gulen put it often in many publications, power resides in truth. Any other power otherwise founded was destined to fail. And so the end of Fethullah Gulen's earthly life, whenever it would happen, would hardly be the end of Hizmet or of altruism without borders. Eternal truth could not be contained by an authoritarian's ambitions. Fethullah Gulen had lived for a peace that surpassed understanding because it was a peace that surpassed the superficial limits of time and space. After all, even a Sufi in exile whirled in a light far more substantial than mere earthly matter, caught up in an energy that was present at the very beginning of creation and that would be there at the end of time. Thank you.
Professor Pahl has mentioned or raised the question of whether the vision of Gulen is merely utopian. I can remember in my undergraduate degree at the University of Auckland studying the utopian thinkers, and my favourite was a French one, in whose utopia the sea would be turned to lemonade. I thought that was actually quite a good idea. But what I've also seen personally is that the kind of love and dialogue that is referred to is a costly commitment. On a visit to Pakistan a couple of years ago, my wife and I had the privilege of visiting a couple of the schools that have been established by the Islamic movement. And this was after the time when the Turkish government, in the form of its president actually, visiting the country, had withdrawn visas from the local Islamic teachers, and we were able to sit with them during the time of what was a very agonising period for them. We saw also the standards of high excellence compassion and care that were evidenced in the way that the schools approached those students fortunate enough to study there. But you didn't come here to hear me. We now have a response from Professor Pratt. Thank you very much, Professor.
I'm wired up, and this is also wired up, is that right?
That's for the
Oh,
camera.
oh, thank you. Sorry, I was getting a bit confused suddenly. Right. Well, Professor Pahl, thank you so much for your address, bringing together for us the motif of altruism and the life of Fethullah Gulen and all that he stands for. And I've come up with 4 words which I'd like to think somehow encapsulate some of the things you've said, but also might draw us on into a deeper thinking about both altruism and the movements that Gulen has inspired. And these words are 2 couplets, a little bit of couplets. Authenticity and acceptance, compassion and capacity. And even as you were talking, I thought these words that I picked up, chances are I picked it up because I've read your book, or just about. I'm not quite finished, hadn't quite finished the last chapter and hadn't quite made it before tonight. But authenticity, it reminds me that, and I'm glad you ended up where you did, because I think it would be fair to say that Gulen himself would not want the movement that he's inspired to actually be focused on him.
No.
He's all about deen, the essential idea of faith through the lens of Islam. The peace of God, the peace of Allah, the compassion of the Almighty, the compassion of God, lived out in and through the people of God. And of course, in using that language, people of God, that could apply, as it does, to the peoples of the book, equally, Muslims, Christians, Jews, and others that follow God. And that reminds me, that authenticity reminds me that along with the Gulen movement, there is another movement called the Common Word, which came out of Jordan. And that Common Word shafts back the responsibility of Jews, Christians, and Muslims to take seriously Torah. Behold, the Lord your God, your Lord is one. Whoops, not lean on this. And love your God and love your neighbour. Essential commands, the essential kind of driving ideas of what makes faith in God, faith in God. And that comes through, I think, in much of what Gulen himself has been on about. Authenticity as to who we are. Authenticity as people of faith. And that goes with acceptance. Acceptance of what? Acceptance of diversity. This creation is a diverse creation. We are diverse peoples. This is not an accident. This is the way the Creator created. One of my favourite images to highlight notions of diversity, because it's a rich image in our faith traditions, is the image of the Garden of Eden, the image of paradise, the paradisical garden. What would you imagine that garden to look like? The flat lawn of a bowling green? Every blade of grass exactly the same height? No other colour? Just the same flowers? Daffodils and nothing but daffodils? Or a rich profusion of colour, of species, of plants, tall, short, all sorts? I venture to suggest that your idea of the Garden of Eden, a bit like mine, is that it would be very diverse, very rich, very fulfilling, exciting even. If the garden image is anything like a reflection of the mind, the will of the Creator, then of course we live in a world of incredible diversity, including within the human realm. And we see the effect of that diversity and the need to accept it and work with that diversity when we recognise what's driving so much of the negative side, which Professor Pahl mentioned, which in my language is the rejection of diversity. Exclusivisms, the exclusionary actions from both certain religious as well as political directions, and sometimes when they're combined it's a potent combination which can only be labelled as evil because it rejects diversity and it seeks to eliminate that which it rejects. And that's been the tragic lot of humankind 100 or so years ago, in the opening decades of the 20th century, right through to the midpoint of the 20th century. And I fear the wheel has turned and we're facing similar things today. But then the counterpoint to all this, of course, is compassion. The compassion of the Creator who created us and who imbued us with this capacity of empathy and fellow feeling. It's curious how it comes out at times with very relatively ordinary things in the sense of, somebody has an accident or something happens to someone, there's a misfortune, and people gather round, even in an earthquake, people do things. We show compassion one to another. We could go on for that, but my time is just about up. I'll come to that last word, capacity. And here I think we see what has been part of the genius of what Fethler Gulen himself inspired, which was also referenced by what Professor Pahl said to us. The Hizmet movement, Hizmet service, has been fostered by stimulating capacity. You can't, if you're going to act compassionately and do things like in education, like social service, like reaching out in all sorts of ways, there has to be some undergirding base and capacity to deliver. And the capacity is, I think, in two forms. It is it is a material capacity, that is, you've got to have, a certain amount of wealth generated in order to be able to do things with it. But that generation and that motivation and that execution has got to be guided by the spiritual, the values, the moral capacity. And so you have then these things tied up together. The authenticity of faith, the acceptance of diversity and the need that comes with that, the compassion to respond and to act appropriately, and the building of capacity in order to act. So it's not just hot air, it's actually doing things. So I think, as was mentioned, Fethler Gulen is in his closing years. I would like to think that the movement that he has inspired is a stimulus to authentic Islam that goes beyond him, beyond the movement, beyond Turkey and into the wider world, because that's where it is heading, and can connect and as well as inspire others. Faithful service becomes then the vehicle of altruism. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you very much. We do have some time for some questions, discussion and debate. As I left my watch at home this morning, I've arranged with a colleague at the back to go like this if it goes on for too long. I'm very pleased, Professor Pratt, that you mentioned that word capacity, which would go with another word, agency, people feeling that they actually are free to act. And we could, I guess, go home tonight having heard these wonderful principles, this deep and rich teaching from Fethler Gulen, and yet be asking ourselves, how can I do something about this in the days that lie ahead? Of course I can associate myself with something like the Pearl of the Islands Foundation, but how can some kind of substance be given to these ideas of authenticity and so on? So can I ask you to respond to that, John, and then perhaps we can open it up to everyone else to speak.
3 things, again, in Mr. Guillen's life, and 3 things in Mr. Guillen's life and in the global Hizmet movement. Education. Contribute in whatever way you can to the education of the next generation. That's parenting, that's teaching, that's mentoring, that's being what Jonathan Schell calls being a universal parent to the next generation. So, education, wealth generation. So, developing that capacity, I love that word. The Hizmet movement has done very well at building social capital and had been doing very well, at least in Turkey, building material capital to support the work that they were doing. But as you heard, much of that material capital was stolen. So we need philanthropists and people to contribute resources, material resources, to support the work of Hizmet and similar allied agencies around the globe. And finally, dialogue. Drink tea, make friends, repeat.
Actually, I have a very serious question for you, John. If you don't drink tea but you like coffee, does it still work? Questions, comments, discussion from the floor, please, sir.
Yeah, talking about...
Can I give you this microphone so that it makes it easier for everyone?
Altruists, I'm a Christian. I'm a student of Professor Brad in 2011. Started taking 31 paper in Auckland U for interreligious. I still remember I was after that I haven't seen you for it's the first time. I acknowledge you and I acknowledge you. I was being pastored by my son, who's a vegan, and to be altruism, his way of. It sounds like he's having a religious fundamentalist sense of thinking that to be compassionate, love, we should not be cruelty to animals. We should be vegetarian, it's more like Buddhism, but higher form of Buddhism and Hinduism. So they are non-violent. If all my practice veganism, I have a lot of argument with it because I'm trying to be vegetarian for my personal health, not for really for their. So he educated me with videos and that scientific base, you see, not like religion research. So I'd like to ask everyone, what do you think of veganism? What are they? And I'm very puzzled, and they're quite, in Australia recently, there's one woman who's a vegan. She sued the neighbor for smelling fish, barbecue fish. Taken to court. So I'd like to have some sort of answer.
You can take this one.
And I believe, by the way, that thousands of people are planning to have a large barbecue outside the vegan stuff.
No, I mean anything good can be taken. Anything good can be taken to an unpleasant extreme. And unfortunately, veganism is something that's good. If you look at the globe and industrial farming and what it does to the planet, and what too much meat consumption does to our bodies. We recently moved from Philadelphia to Wisconsin, and within the first year of living in this, America's dairy land, where there's lots of beef and chickens and things, I gained 30 pounds, right? So when we recognize, the health benefits of being a vegan, many Hindus around the globe have been following this for thousands of years. So, but again, the basic point is anything good can be taken to a negative extreme, and the righteous mind, that is the self-righteous mind, can be a real dangerous problem.
Thank you. Would you like to add to it? Maybe we should be promoting the intermittent fasting diet a bit more. What other questions or comments, please? Don't be afraid to speak up. And thank you, sir. I'll bring the microphone to you.
I was just wondering whether you could speak a little bit about the concept of charity and whether charity can be harmful I did look up the Islamic word for charity, but you will know it better than I do, and comment on that, because it talks about charity as identified with altruism, not having to care for the consequence, perhaps.
Thank you. You want to try that one?
Yeah.
Let's stand up.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds
The
good.
counsel that I received from my wife.
Charity, yes. You ask a very interesting question. I'd have to have some, deeper thinking about that, because off the cuff, it's sort of hard to respond to think of it as being negative. But if I may just step to one side slightly, I don't know whether you picked up on this, but I think it was Jonathan Sacks who used a very intriguing phrase. It was hard to get my head around. Altruistic evil. And I guess I'm thinking, going from where I think he came out with that one to maybe thinking that there are possibilities of charity, like it really was following on from the comment before. Just about anything can be taken to some kind of extreme. Like, promoting of vegetarianism can have some health benefits, as is mentioned, but it can be taken to an extreme. Some people need to have the protein that comes from meat, and some people don't. But in all cases, the extremist angle is to impose a view and thereby reject diversity. So I guess the charity, trying to see if I can hook that into your charity question, I guess the problem, the one pressure point I'm aware that comes through in some cultures is a pressure to be charitable when one doesn't really have the capacity. And that can then drive poverty, which then creates a source of need of charity from others. So that it's like, taking any value, if you can't match the desire to do something with the capacity to do it, then you're going to end up in some kind of strife. But I suspect too, I think it's the issue that's now come to mind, is this one where there are sometimes cultural and even religious pressures for people to act charitably in a context where they don't really have the capacity to, and that actually can cause considerable problems.
That's also thinking of the receiving of charity.
Oh, well, the reception end, yeah, right, yes. They use that. I was thinking purely on the giving side of it. Yeah. Oh, yes. Of course, that has been a problem. How often have we heard the phrase, "Oh, I don't really want your charity." I don't want to be on the receiving end, because charity can then, on that sense, can suggest that the person who's receiving the charity is somehow needy and deficient and incapable, and hence, that's how the charity is delivered. Which then brings in another word, and the word is partnership. And partnership can then have a sense of assistance and aid, which can then become reciprocal. I'll help you when you've got your need, but pass it forward or pass it back, pass it on. Don't just be a passive recipient only. And that takes a bit of cultivation. So yes, it shows you, isn't it? Things that can have sound positive, can sometimes have negative elements. Yes, both in receiving and the giving. Thank you for that one.
Just real briefly, if I can respond to this as well. There's a wonderful book called Toxic Charity. That's about how social service agencies can perpetuate cycles of inequality, and primarily in the United States, but elsewhere. And I think that's a real concern. But as someone who leads a congregation, you need much more charity. In fact, that was a bit of a joke, bad joke. But the fact of the matter is, we need more people who are charitably inclined toward others, who follow what Mr. Guillain calls hoshpuru, to see others nicely, to see others as God sees them with eyes of mercy and compassion. And that means we engage freely, we risk what we have in goodness towards others, not in some sort of paternalistic approach.
Well said. Of course, certain forms of charity can create a culture of dependence, can't they? I found my own way of contributing to charity. I'm a dedicated shopper at op shops around. It's, you can get a bargain and feel good at the same time. What other comments, questions or thoughts inspired by our speakers tonight? Yes, please.
Just leading on from what we were talking about, so you used the word authenticity before, so the giving of charity and the authenticity that goes with that is also highly relevant in Maimonides' 8 levels of charity.
Yeah, no,
Probably be familiar with.
I think that's right. I think it's kind of when you take a particular value and look at enacting it, then the trick is how other values connect to it. Because if they don't, then, for example, a person can be charitable, but come across as very officious and perhaps disrespectful to the person on the receiving end. And so on, so I think it's really, yes, a case of getting that balance. So if you're acting charitably, then acting with compassion and with, yes, seeing the other and authenticity of yourself and for the other, which is the acceptance of that diversity. So they tie together.
What he said.
What other questions or comments? Yes.
Thanks, Chris. My question to John Pahl is, you're a Christian, but to live as a Muslim. Why did you write about him? So what was your journey? So that's the question.
This one.
That's a tiny little question. I wrote about him because I see a harmony with many of the deepest virtues and practices within Christianity. I just completed a book on religion and violence. It was a painful, difficult book to write, to see how people can take religion and abuse it and pervert it, to destroy it. So I was looking for a happier topic. Now, of course, it didn't quite turn out that way. And I should have known that. But seriously, I was studying religious peace builders, and that's the book I'm working on now. It's entitled Becoming Religious Peace. It focuses on this emergence of religious peace building over the course of the 20th century, from Gandhi to Lima Boe, with Mr. Gillan in the middle, and lots of other people whose names start with G. So Gandhi, Boe, Gillan. You took the alliteration path, I couldn't resist. Seriously though, I was looking, I wanted to study happier presentations of religion, how religion in fact has contributed to good, and answering the question, why have these religions been around for millennia? And as I grew closer to people identified with Mr. Gillan or associated with Mr. Gillan, inspired by him, he seemed to me a paradigmatic example of this. And so I thought, let's see what happens with the biography. There was no critical biography of Mr. Gillan. And I was fortunate to receive some great support from people. The Alliance for Shared Values, when I was nearly done with the research, gave me a grant to help me wrap up the writing. And it wouldn't have happened without that. So really grateful for that support. And the intrinsic joy of meeting people who care. I mean, it sounds so simple, doesn't it? And yet it really has been the greatest gift in this research for me. To meet friends, to make new friends all over the globe who are working really hard out of the depths of their faith to make the world a more just, peaceful place. And, why wouldn't you write on this?
John, just in passing, I know that my surname also begins with G. I do have a question for you both, really. When you think about service, his men, you're talking about what I suggested before as a costly commitment. And Professor Pratt, you also mentioned the word extremism. Is there a difference between extremism and the kind of commitment that says, I'm giving my whole life to the service of humanity, to the service of the world, this is what I'm all about? Can you call that extremism? Or is that something else?
No, I wouldn't call that extremism. I'd call that intense commitment. No, we use these words in different ways. One of the things I'm aware of is that in all our religious traditions, faiths, we have a sense of the absolute. And from that absolute comes absolute values. The problem is when absolute values are taken and to create an absolutism, which is a selection of some values to the expense of other values very often. And a denial of the relativities into which the absolute values have been brought in. So that, for example, in our sacred texts, we have expressions of absolute truth and value, but always couched in a context in which they were enunciated, recorded, written down, and a context of interpretation and analysis and narrative. And very often we miss the point and the counterpoint within our traditions and our texts. To give you one classic example, we all would probably, whatever our tradition, familiar with the phrase of to do with beating your swords into plowshares and your spears into pruning hooks. Comes from the book of Isaiah. What's less well known is from the book of Joel is a text of exactly the reverse. Of beating our plowshares into swords and our pruning hooks into spears. Same Holy Scripture, totally opposite text. And what happens is that an extremist perspective takes the negative text and absolutizes it and takes it out of context and uses that together with other texts to promote a notion of a judgmental, violent God who backs everything I do and nothing you do, and so on. So there are absolutes and there are absolutisms. And it's the absolutisms which lie behind what we popularly express as fundamentalism or fundamentalisms. And it's interesting because I'm sort of rolling on with it here, but it actually plugs into an experience which is not unlike yours, John Paul, which is, I just published a book with Bloomsbury just over a year ago, Religion and Extremism, the subtext being rejecting diversity, looking at extremism in Judaism, Christianity and Islam, both in terms of the text and recent history, and then looking at Islamophobia and the current evolution of what I call reactive co-radicalisation, which is going on and cranking up. So that's just by the by to one side, but it comes back to that question of how we respond to the faith context.
I do remember being taught that a text without a context is a pretext.
Oh, very good.
What other? Yes, ma'am.
I'd just like to know more about the expression wealth generation, because you have ignorance and then education, which is a way out of ignorance, and you have non-violence, and you have the building bridges. But wealth generation sounds very, really on the top. You know, it's not just leading out of poverty; it's wealth. Is that the Turkish word, or is that a translation mistake?
Yeah, that's my, may not be the best translation of what's going on. I mean, a better way to describe what's happening within Hizmet is social enterprise. That is taking the generation of wealth, which is crucial for any business, right? For any organization to be sustainable, there has to be that capacity. There has to be that capital, right? And that's just realistic. And unfortunately, far too often, religious people don't pay attention to those details, to our detriment. You know, I'm looking at our church's budget, about 20,000 behind this year. Okay, so that's behind in the back of my mind. But really, it's social enterprise. That is taking the energy of capitalism, because capitalism isn't going away. And really moving beyond it, and moving beyond the dichotomy between capitalism and socialism into social enterprise. That is, taking the energies of wealth generation and using that not to generate wealth for one's individual benefit, but for social purposes, to solve the social problems that we face. I mean, the chief exponent of this, best known, is probably Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel laureate in economics, who started the practice of micro-lending as a way to generate wealth. When you're making $1 a day, and you all of a sudden start making $2 a day, that's huge in your life. And so in that sense, wealth generation is something that's necessary and crucial. Again, if it serves social purposes, if it is then channeled into solving the problems that we face in the community, which is how it works within Hizmet. The phrase is Himet for Hizmet, fundraising for service.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, capacity is a great word, much better word than wealth generation, but it does take wealth.
I guess it depends on the baseline from which you're measuring wealth.
Mm-hmm.
Or your concept of wealth. Now, sir, you had a...
My background is cultural anthropology. I was a young Christian. I left my church in 1959 or so because it was so boring. It didn't seem relevant at all. And it was us and them. And I just couldn't handle that. So I went off and started to look at world religions. And my minister got quite concerned and asked to come to my parents' house and meet with us all. And he said, I'm concerned about Noel. He seems to be wandering into dark areas. And anyhow, a school friend of mine said, let's go to my church. And his church, I was Presbyterian. I am Presbyterian again. St. Luke's very liberal Presbyterian church, very inclusive and everything else. At the time I was in high school, and my school friend invited me to go to the Baptist church. That was sort of like going out of frying pan into the fire. If you didn't have a plaque, a brass plaque on the wall that said your family had been in the China Inland Mission, or the Afghan Border Crusade, or the Punjab Jagadri Mission, you didn't really meet the standard. Anyhow, a long series of experiments and searchings brought me back to my church when I came back to New Zealand. But goodwill is the most important thing that average people need to be able to reach out to others and accept when other people reach out to them. And at St. Luke's at the moment we have a Meet Your Neighbours program, and we go to gurdwaras and masjids and temples and Zen Buddhist groups and all sorts of other things to get an understanding. And so often you find that we share so much that we put on our blinkers and don't see that. My father used to say, and you talk about, maybe your jokes about being bludgeoned. My father used to always say, son, always remember, you can lead a horse to the water, but you can't make it drink. And then he had a little phrase his father had given him, which was a little frame above his desk, and it said, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. So goodwill, and this is where I'll finish, had brought me twice into Muslim families. I went to Kashmir in 1978 for the first time. Two places I always wanted to go, Tibet and Kashmir. Well, China went to change Tibet, so that's not what I wanted to see. I went to Kashmir, and it was in flux, but it was a happier place than it was to be later. In that place, I was welcomed into a household, and I'm still Uncle Noel, and whenever there's anything crucial in their lives, they ask for my prayers and they ask me what to do. And the father-in-law of that family was trying to get hold of the land that his daughter's husband had in Srinagar, and he'd actually split them up. And so I had to go to the Quran and find verses that had to deal with divorce, families, keeping families together, that sort of thing. And in a beautiful beautifully illustrated with sort of artwork. I sent this letter to the daughter who had been prevailed upon by her father to do what was happening, breaking the family up. And I reminded them that they had 2 daughters, and those daughters would have a harder time getting married if they came from a broken up family. Anyhow, they all came together again by God's power, not mine. And now they are a thriving family. The older one is married now and has 2 children. The younger one is studying medicine in Kazakhstan. And when I'll get these letters, please pray for me, I'm going through my exams right now. And things like that. The other experience with Islam, and I was privileged to be able to look after the family when the father had to go to New Delhi for medical care. He put me in charge of the household woman to look after them while he was away, because Kashmir has been going through troubles for some time. And he wanted to have someone looking after his household. During the Sierra Leonean Civil War, 1991 to 2002, I was moved to try to adopt a child from there. It's still very touching to me, but because of the war and various other things, the adoption didn't get properly completed, but I did get the uplift order sent to me at one stage. I tried to bring my son to New Zealand, but they said because I didn't have the rest of the documentation, they didn't recognise it, so I'm still trying to get him down here now. He's stuck in the United Arab Emirates. But he's a Muslim, and I was asked by him, are you going to convert him? And I said, that's a matter for him. If he asks questions and wants to know things, I can help him, but he's not going to be adopted to be browbeaten into being something that he's not yet familiar with. And he's such a godly person. I helped him set up a charity in Freetown, and it's for Ebola orphans and things like that. Anyhow, this has brought me into intimate contact with Muslims, and I've found so many wonderful things in those experiences. Oh yes, we all have glaringly horrible things, and some of the things that have been taught over the centuries. If we can accept, in the spirit of goodwill, that what's more important is to work together, hand in hand, not, I'll do my bit, but you keep well away from us. Okay, God is one, and so we can be one as well. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you very much. Thanks for sharing that experience. And by the way, Noel, if you want some real excitement in the church context, there's a fantastic African migrant church in Onehunga.
Oh, really?
Where you'll see about 3 or 4 European Kiwis and all the rest are African and Indians, and you need to have your dancing shoes on. What other question? I have no idea how we're going in terms of time, but I'm not looking to rush away. And last question. Thank you. Who would like to ask them the last question? Sir.
It's not a question at all, it's a promotion for another event happening at this venue. The David Watkin Memorial Lecture happens annually, and this year it's Susan Heady from the Auckland University on the topic of building a community of communities, challenge for Aotearoa New Zealand in the light of the Christchurch massacre. So since the people here, many are Muslim, I thought I would bring that to your attention. It's the 26th of this month at 7 p.m. at this place.
Cool. Thank you for doing that, an important topic. And thank you to both our keynote speaker and the respondent tonight for their insights and comments. And now it's my job to hand over to my friend Abdul.
Kia ora. Peace be upon you all. I am welcoming each and every one of you. We have a small gift to our guest speakers. Can I invite Andrew Codling, his our advisor? So, small gift to John Pahl. This is a new process of gift giving. We open the gift. This is New Zealand, Turkish New Zealand way.
When in New Jersey, do as New Jerseyans do.
invite Michael Wood for local MP. To Professor Douglas Pratt, please. And also, lastly, can I call Naomi Johnson, please? Thank you very much for your attending. Have a good night.